The summer outside was scorching, but the air on our terrace was steeped in the coolness of the evening breeze and the faint aromas of lavender candles. The guests, lawyers, investors, neighbors who I always felt were more like accessories to our luxurious lifestyle than genuine friends, were happily devouring oysters and expensive cocktails. Louis, my husband, gleamed in his perfect suit, effortlessly navigating between jokes and serious conversations. I stood by the drinks table, absent-mindedly twirling a glass of champagne in my hands. Toasts followed one after another, and soon Louis raised his glass. He spoke of our perfect life, of how I inspired him, how I supported him in all his endeavors. His voice carried confidence, tinged with a faint note of feigned admiration. Everyone looked at me, smiling. What a happy couple, they must have thought. I smiled back as expected. But inside, it was a different story. This dazzling facade we had built together felt more artificial with every passing day. People laughed, Louis kissed me on the cheek, but behind it all there was nothing. No warmth, no sincerity. "Emma, you look stunning, as always," said one of the guests, Diana, the wife of Louis's partner. She seemed like one of those women who knew how to stay afloat amidst the ebb and flow of other people's emotions. "Thank you, Diana," I replied, hoping my smile was convincing enough. Stunning, I thought to myself. That word had long since become the mask I wore, but sometimes it felt as though this mask had fused so tightly to my skin that I no longer knew where the real me ended, and this artificial perfection began. When the guests started leaving, I leaned against one of the terrace columns, staring into the darkness. Louis approached from behind and wrapped his arms around me, but the gesture was as cold as a late autumn evening. "You were incredible tonight. Everyone was in awe of you," he said with a wink, as if delivering a business report. "Thank you," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He let me go and returned to the guests to see them off. And I stayed there, standing still, feeling something inside me quietly crumble into emptiness. The next morning, as usual, I woke up before Louis. Sunlight filled our spacious bedroom, but instead of warmth, I felt a chill. Standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee in hand, I pondered how much of my life had begun to resemble a farce. How much longer could I maintain this fragile illusion of balance? Louis came downstairs a few minutes later, impeccably dressed even on a weekend. His suit was replaced with relaxed but unmistakably expensive trousers and a shirt. The familiar mask of confidence played across his face. "Emma, we need to talk," he said, taking a sip of coffee. There was a seriousness in his voice I hadn't expected. "About what?" I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Louis rarely initiated conversations that strayed beyond work or my duties at home. "It's about Josh. He's going through a rough patch. He called me yesterday and said his agency shut down. He's out of work and doesn't have money to keep his apartment." Louis paused, seemingly waiting for some response from me. "And?" I knew what he wanted to suggest, but needed him to say it aloud. "I thought he could stay with us, just temporarily, until he finds something more stable." Louis spoke calmly, as if suggesting we bring a chair in from another room. I set my cup down on the table a bit more forcefully than I intended. The last time I'd seen Josh was years ago. He was the polar opposite of Louis. Free-spirited, emotional, sometimes even reckless. At one time, his energy had seemed magnetic to me, but now, in the context of our settled, predictable life, it was more a source of unease. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked cautiously. "Emma, he's my brother. It's only temporary." His tone left no room for negotiation. I nodded, feeling an inexplicable unease begin to grow in my chest. By evening, Josh had already arrived. I heard the sound of his car in the driveway but couldn't make out much through the window. When the door opened, he entered with a boisterous laugh and a grin. His backpack was enormous, as if he'd just returned from a round-the-world trip, and he carried a box of vinyl records under one arm. "Emma, my God, it's been ages!" His voice was as warm as I remembered. but there was an unusual lightness to him that stood out starkly against Lewis's reserved demeanor. "Hi, Josh," I said, forcing a smile. His sharp eyes seemed to catch my feigned cheerfulness immediately, but he said nothing. Lewis and I helped him settle into one of the guest rooms. Josh didn't seem the least bit uncomfortable. He surveyed the house, complimented the decor, and made jokes that clearly irritated Lewis. Their brotherly relationship had always been strained. Josh seemed to go out of his way to highlight his disregard for the rules Lewis held so dear. By the end of the day, I realized I was feeling a strange restlessness. This house was used to quiet, to an orderly routine. And with Josh around, silence seemed impossible. The morning began with the familiar clinking of coffee cups. Lewis had already left for work, leaving the house in a comfortable silence. I assumed Josh was still asleep, but I was wrong. He was in the kitchen. Dressed in a wrinkled t-shirt and worn jeans, he was the complete opposite of his brother. "Good morning," he said, barely glancing at me, his voice slightly hoarse as if he'd just woken up. "Good morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Josh was seated at the table, holding a vinyl record in his hands, studying it like some ancient relic. On the counter next to him lay his camera, lenses, and a book without a cover. There was something oddly charming about the casual disarray of it all. "What are you reading?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "Hemingway," he said, looking up. "An old edition. Found it in a box in the attic yesterday. Did you know you had treasures like this up there?" "No," I laughed. "Must have been left by the previous owner of the house." He nodded, and after a pause, looked at me directly. His gaze was steady but unintrusive, as though he saw more than he let on. "You're a literature teacher, right?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, slightly flustered. Although it sounds better than it feels. Sometimes I think my job is just giving lectures about things no one wants to hear. "And what would you do if you could choose?" he asked, setting the record aside. I was surprised by the question, and for some reason couldn't give the usual rehearsed answer. His gaze held a sincerity that made me feel he genuinely wanted to know. "Probably," I'd write. I used to want to. But then came responsibilities, real life, all of that. I realized I was speaking too openly, but for some reason, I couldn't stop. "Then do it," he said simply, as if suggesting I bake a pie. I smirked, shaking my head. But there was something about his words that lingered in my mind like a splinter. Later, closer to lunchtime, I agreed to go with Josh to the farmer's market. He insisted, saying he needed inspiration for a new photo project and that I needed a change of scenery. The market was bustling with life. People, stalls overflowing with fruits, the smell of fresh pastries. It all suddenly felt so vibrant, so real. We wandered through the booths, and Josh clicked away with his camera, occasionally making unexpected remarks. "Look at how the light falls on this wooden crate. Amazing, isn't it?" he said, pointing at a pile of apples. I couldn't help but smile. His attention to such small details was almost infectious. In one of the antique shops we stumbled into, he found an old book of poetry. As he flipped through its worn pages, he suddenly handed it to me. "This is for you," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Why?" I asked, trying to mask the wave of emotion that rose in me. "Because I'm sure you'll appreciate it more than anyone else." I couldn't find the words to respond. A deep, strange feeling stirred inside me, something I couldn't quite explain. When we returned home, I realized my thoughts weren't drifting to Lewis, but to those fleeting moments I'd spent with Josh. I tried to convince myself that it was just a mild admiration brought on by the stark contrast between his ease and the tension in my marriage. But something told me it was much more complicated than that. The next morning, I found Josh in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. He was standing by the window, gazing outside as if studying something intently. The light fell on his face, highlighting features that seemed so distinctly opposite to Lewis's: ease, carelessness, and a childlike spontaneity. "Do you always get up this early?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Only when there's good coffee in the house. He replied with a smile that made me instinctively smile back. We started chatting. At first, it was about trivial things: movies, books, work. But as the minutes passed, the conversation grew deeper, unexpectedly touching on topics I had long avoided even with myself. Lewis mentioned you always dreamed of being a writer, he said suddenly. I felt my pulse quicken. I had buried those dreams long ago under layers of daily routines and convenient excuses. Yes, but life has a way of interfering. It feels unrealistic now, I said, shrugging, trying to mask the bitterness that rose with those words. You know, he said, setting his cup down, I've met people who say life took their dreams from them. But I don't think it's life. I think it's us. We give up. His words hit me harder than I was prepared to admit. I tried to change the subject, but the thought lingered in my mind throughout the day. Later, after another day of Lewis being away at the office, Josh suggested going to the farmer's market to pick up fresh produce. I was surprised at how easily I agreed, but these outings had become something special. We strolled among the stalls, choosing vegetables and fruits. Josh frequently stopped to take photos, capturing random, fleeting moments. Why do you photograph such simple things? I asked, watching him snap a picture of a woman selecting flowers. Because simplicity is always honest. There's something real in it, he said, his words carrying that effortless depth that made me see the world differently. At one point, he approached me holding an old book of poetry. The letters on the cover were nearly faded, but I recognized the works of W.H. Auden. This is for you, he said, handing me the book. Why? I asked, feeling a strange warmth rise within me. Because I see the same thing in your eyes as I see in these poems. Depth. You've just forgotten it's there. I took the book, unable to respond. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt something dangerous and inevitable stirring between us. That evening, I realized I was waiting for the moment when Lewis would go upstairs. Unconsciously, I found myself seeking out Josh, just to talk again. His lightness and curiosity about life made me see the world from a different angle. He was so far removed from my marriage, which increasingly resembled a partnership of two people whose lives had become so entangled with others' expectations that they had forgotten their own desires. The botanical garden had always been my refuge, a place where I could be alone, lost in my thoughts, and, even if briefly, feel free. I often came here by myself, wandering the paths and breathing in the freshness. But that day was different. I was walking along a familiar trail, inhaling the scent of blooming lilies, when the click of a camera broke my usual meditative state. I turned and saw Josh. He was standing a short distance away, holding his camera, its lens pointed directly at me. What are you doing here? I asked, startled. What do you think? He said with a smile, lowering the camera. Taking photos. I didn't know you liked this place too. This is my spot for quiet, I replied, unsure whether to feel pleased by his presence or uneasy about it. He stepped closer, and I could feel the tension between us becoming almost tangible. I'd like to take your portrait, he said suddenly. Why? My voice came out almost defensively. Because you don't see yourself as you really are, but I do. The words were simple, yet they carried such depth that I didn't know how to respond. I allowed him to photograph me. I stood beneath the trees, feeling his gaze through the lens as though it was peeling back layers, revealing something hidden and vulnerable. All done, he said after a few minutes. Then he approached, setting the camera aside. His eyes were serious, almost searching. That was you, just as you are, without the masks. I tried to make a joke to diffuse the tension, but he suddenly lifted a hand and gently tucked a strand of hair back into place where the wind had blown it loose. The touch was so light, yet it sent an electric jolt through me. Time seemed to stop. I stepped back instinctively as though the gesture itself was dangerous. And he, as if sensing this, smiled faintly but said nothing. That evening, I could still feel his touch. I tried to distract myself, tidying up the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, even attempting to read. But nothing worked. When Josh walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, I froze. We both knew something had shifted. It was a moment neither of us could ignore. He looked at me in a way no one ever had before, with an honesty and raw emotion that was almost overwhelming. "Emma," he began, but I raised a hand as if to stop him. "Don't," I whispered. But he continued, his voice soft and steady. "I can't stop thinking about you. It's wrong, but it's stronger than me." His confession struck like a thunderclap. I wanted to argue, to say it wasn't possible, that I couldn't allow myself to even entertain the thought. But all I could do was stand there, silently staring at him. The seconds stretched out, and the tension between us became unbearable, something neither of us could pretend wasn't there. That night, I barely slept. My mind was a whirlwind of questions with no answers. I knew I was standing on the edge of a precipice. And yet, something within me was already prepared to take the step. The house had sunk into the stillness of the night. Louis had long since gone to bed, as had most of our neighbors in this quiet, orderly neighborhood. But I was still sitting in the kitchen, aimlessly turning over a book I hadn't even opened. My mind swirled with the events of the past few days, especially that moment in the botanical garden. It felt like my thoughts were being torn between reason and something deeper, something inexplicable. I heard the soft creak of a door and turned. Josh was standing in the doorway. In the faint glow of the nightlight, he looked tired, but his gaze was filled with the same emotions I had seen in the garden. "You're still up?" he asked, crossing the kitchen to the refrigerator. "I can't sleep," I admitted, trying to sound calm, though my voice faltered slightly. He grabbed a bottle of water, unscrewed the cap, and took a few sips. Then, without saying a word, he sat down at the table across from me. For a few moments, we simply sat in silence, as if both of us were searching for something to say, but too afraid to speak it aloud. "You're avoiding me," he said suddenly. I tensed, unable to deny it. He was right. Since that moment in the garden, I'd tried to keep my distance from him, but my thoughts kept circling back to him, as though he were a magnet I couldn't resist. "It's not that simple, Josh," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, lowering his gaze to his hands, then looked back at me. "I know. And honestly, I've tried to stay away too, but Emma, you know what's happening between us. You can't deny it." A tightness gripped my chest. This was the moment I had both feared and anticipated. We both knew we were standing at the edge of something. That one wrong step could destroy everything. "Josh," I began, but he cut me off. "Tell me you don't feel anything, that it's all in my head. If that's the case, I'll leave, and you'll never see this side of me again. But if it's not..." He trailed off. I wanted to answer. Instead, I just stared at him, and my eyes must have revealed more than I could ever say in words. When his hand reached out to touch mine, everything I had been holding back crumbled. I stood up, and for a moment, we just looked at each other before he took a step forward. In the next instant, we kissed. It was slow and cautious, giving me time to stop him, to pull away. But I didn't. We stayed there for a while, caught in a moment that felt both reckless and inevitable. "Emma," he started, but I shook my head. "I don't know what this means," I whispered, my hands trembling. When he finally left the kitchen, I stayed behind, leaning against the table, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The moment had turned my world upside down, and I knew nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, I avoided Josh. The house was filled with its usual morning bustle, but the air was thick with tension. Louis, as always, rushed off to work, tossing me a quick, "See you tonight," as he left. He didn't even notice my nervousness, but I knew I couldn't hide it for long. Josh, on the other hand, seemed perfectly calm, as though nothing had happened. His composure only added to my unease. When he walked into the kitchen for coffee, I tried to avoid looking at him, but I could feel his presence, his gaze. Everything felt sharper, as if the house had suddenly gained new dimensions. That afternoon, my close friend Megan came over. We sat on the terrace, sipping lemonade, when she suddenly gave me a piercing look. Her eyes had always been sharp, but today, they seemed even more so. "You've changed, Emma," she said, narrowing her eyes slightly. "What do you mean?" I tried to sound nonchalant, but her words made me tense. "You seem happier. The last time I saw you like this was probably before you got married. Has something happened?" I forced a smile, unsure of how to respond. "Has something happened?" Yes, my entire world had turned upside down, but admitting that was impossible. "I'm just trying to spend more time on myself," I said, doing my best to sound convincing. "Are you sure that's all it is?" Megan's gaze was too knowing. I quickly shifted the conversation to another topic, but her suspicions didn't seem to fade. A few days later, while running errands in town, I had an encounter I couldn't have anticipated. Josh and I were sitting in a small cafe, enjoying coffee and light conversation. He was telling me about his latest photography project, and I laughed at his jokes, which felt like a breath of fresh air. Tom, one of Lewis's colleagues, walked into the cafe. His eyes immediately landed on us, lingering just a second too long before he approached. "Emma? What a surprise," he said. "Tom, hi," I replied, trying to hide my unease. "And who's this?" he asked, nodding toward Josh. "Josh, Lewis's younger brother," Josh said calmly, extending his hand. Tom smiled, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He made a quick comment about being in a hurry and left, but I knew that brief encounter could spiral into something much bigger. That evening, when Lewis came home, he seemed unusually tense. He asked me a few casual questions about my day, but there was something guarded in his tone. "Were you in town today?" he asked between sips of wine. "Yes, just picking up some groceries," I replied, keeping my voice even. "And? Josh went with you?" I froze for a moment, but forced myself to answer naturally. "Yes, he needed to check out a few things for his photography." Lewis nodded, but his eyes narrowed slightly. At that moment, I realized he had started to suspect something. The feeling settled over me like a cold wave. Later, sitting alone in our bedroom, I understood how precarious things had become. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, and my heart raced with the knowledge that what Josh and I shared was too powerful to keep hidden. But every passing day made this dangerous game harder to control. Family dinners had always been a tradition, but that evening, the tension in the house was almost palpable. Lewis insisted on a candlelit dinner, as if trying to preserve the illusion of family harmony. He sat at the head of the table, wearing an expression of absolute control, though his eyes betrayed something else, cold and calculating. Josh, on the other hand, appeared relaxed, even slightly amused. His lighthearted demeanor irritated me, as though he wasn't taking any of this seriously. I tried to appear composed, but inside I was barely holding it together. The dinner began like any other. Lewis spoke about work. I nodded silently, and Josh made casual remarks that seemed to annoy Lewis more and more. However, as the meal progressed, something shifted. Lewis suddenly fell silent, then fixed his gaze sharply on me. "Emma," he began, his tone deliberate and weighted. "You've been spending a lot of time in town lately." I felt my breath hitch. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound calm. "Sometimes I need a distraction." "A distraction?" he repeated, his voice tinged with a mocking edge. "From what exactly? Family life?" "Me?" I froze, unsure how to respond. "Leave her alone, Lewis," Josh interjected suddenly, pushing his plate aside. Lewis turned to his brother, his gaze now sharp and threatening. "And you," he said, his voice laced with steel. "Are you her protector now? Defender of her distractions?" "This isn't your concern," Josh replied, his tone devoid of sarcasm but full of defiance. This was the disaster I had been so desperate to prevent. I tried to intervene, to stop them, but Lewis raised a hand, cutting me off. "No, Emma," he said curtly. "I want to know. What's going on? Why is my brother, who has always been a stranger to you, suddenly so involved in your life?" My composure shattered. Before I could respond, Lewis turned to Josh, his voice turning icy. "Tell me the truth. You two—" "Lewis!" I shouted, trying to halt his accusation. "Yes," Josh interrupted, locking eyes with his brother. "Emma and I are closer than you think." The words struck like a bolt of lightning. Lewis stood in silence, his face pale and his jaw clenched. Slowly, he rose, circled the table, and stopped directly in front of me. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, his voice low but so cold it stole my breath. I nodded. It was all I could do. In that moment, he turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard the walls seemed to shake. Left alone with Josh, my legs buckled beneath me and I sank into a chair. He moved closer, his face etched with concern, but I raised a hand to stop him. "This was a mistake," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "Emma," he began, but I shook my head. "Go, Josh. Just go." His gaze was filled with pain, but he didn't argue. He turned and left, the sound of the front door closing behind him echoing through the house. I was alone, surrounded by silence and the wreckage of the chaos we had all created together. Lewis didn't come home. I knew he had left to process everything, but that understanding didn't bring any comfort. The house, once so spacious, now felt suffocating in its emptiness. Josh disappeared just as quickly as he had come. I heard him packing late that night, but couldn't bring myself to step out of my room and see him again. His departure was inevitable, but that didn't make it any less painful. He left behind only a short note on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry for everything. This isn't what I wanted. Take care of yourself, Emma." Lewis reappeared 2 days later. When I saw his car in the driveway, a wave of panic gripped me. He entered the house with a cold, detached expression, as if he had become someone else entirely. "We need to talk," he said without greeting me. We sat in the living room. His gaze was heavy, almost hollow. I wanted to explain, to tell him how it had all happened, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm filing for divorce," he said quietly but firmly. My heart sank. Even though I knew this was a possibility, hearing the words felt like a blow. "Lewis, please," I began, but he raised his hand to silence me. "No, Emma, I don't want to hear excuses. What you've done is unforgivable." I fell silent. His words were like a final judgment, absolute and irreversible. Megan, my best friend, turned her back on me as well. When I told her the truth, hoping for a shred of understanding, she looked at me with such profound disappointment that I wished I could disappear. "You've destroyed everything, Emma," she said, her voice cold and steady. "How can I trust you when you betrayed your own husband?" All that was left for me to do was pack my things and leave. I rented a small cabin by the lake, far from the city, far from the memories, far from the people whose gazes scorched me with judgment. In the first few days, the loneliness was deafening. I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand who I had become and how I had ended up here. It felt as though I had lost everything: my marriage, my friends, and even myself. But in the stillness of those days, I began to feel a strange sense of relief. I was no longer the perfect wife trying to live up to everyone else's expectations. I was just myself, a woman who had made a mistake and now had to live with its consequences. In the quiet nights by the lake, I began to write. Old habits resurfaced, as if I were reacquainting myself with the person I used to be. My pain, my doubts, my sense of being adrift. All of it spilled onto the pages, taking shape and finding meaning. Through writing, I began to rediscover a piece of myself I thought I had lost forever. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to please anyone or fit into a mold. I was simply telling my story, one word at a time. The cottage by the lake became my sanctuary. In its simplicity and solitude, I found what had long seemed lost: There were no lavish parties here, no perfect dinners, no false smiles. Just me, the quiet, and the memories that crept in at night like uninvited guests. Each morning, I woke early to watch the sunlight touch the surface of the water. It was the one constant in my new life. Those sunrises filled with something soothing and real. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything that overwhelmed me: the pain, the disappointment, the anger, the regret, and occasionally faint glimmers of hope. At first, it was excruciating. Writing about how I had destroyed my life meant reliving it over and over. But with each entry, I felt a small part of the weight lift. I stopped trying to justify myself, even to myself. I accepted what had happened, and that acceptance became the first step toward freedom. I began venturing out among people again, though it was difficult at first. In the small lakeside town, there was a literary club, and I decided to join, hoping to reconnect with the part of myself I had lost. The people in the group were kind, though I initially felt like an outsider. Slowly, I started participating in discussions, sharing my thoughts. For the first time in what felt like forever, my opinion was heard, and I realized how long it had been since anyone asked me what I thought. "You write well," said one of the members, Martha, after I read a short story I'd written. "Thank you," I replied, feeling an unexpected warmth. Her words weren't empty or polite. They were genuine. In those moments, I began to feel whole again. One day, while walking along the shore, I saw an elderly couple sitting on a bench. They were silent, their hands entwined, their gazes calm and steady. It was such a stark contrast to the love I had known. No passion, no struggle, just something quiet and dependable. I paused, wondering if I would ever want to feel that again. The answer was yes, but I knew that before I could open my heart to someone else, I needed to understand myself first. Later, I found an old notebook filled with my earliest writings. Reading the lines written by a young, dreamy Emma, I realized how far I had strayed from that girl, trying so hard to meet others' expectations. I cried as I traced the neat handwriting, but the tears weren't of sorrow. They were of release. I began writing stories again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. These stories were about people who made mistakes, lost themselves, but eventually found their way back. They were about life as it is: messy, complicated, real. Eventually, I started submitting my work to small magazines. One of my stories was published. It didn't change everything overnight, but it was a reminder that I could rebuild my life, piece by piece. Sitting by the window with a cup of tea, I looked out over the lake and realized my life had fallen apart, but it had been necessary. I was no longer trying to be perfect. I no longer hid behind a facade. I was simply myself with all my flaws and mistakes. And for the first time in a long while, that felt right.